the issue of responsibility towards the other person. But the intention of the Pardes section was to try to find modes of reading Scripture that would recondition and reorient the self through these hermeneutical traditional methods to different ways of perceiving the world in its claim upon one, beginning with the level of the plain physical sense, moving to the level of culture, which is the level of drash, to the level of spiritual exercises and a more cosmic notion. So the other people feel that the ethical didn't come across in that Pardes model. I'd like to hear.
I just wanted to follow up and say,
I don't mind the criticism. I want to hear if you felt that it didn't. The ethic. In other words, I'm going to talk more about this in the succeeding weeks about these different levels of consciousness. But I was trying to use 4 hermeneutical methods, traditional, as a way of reattuning the self to seeing the world under different conditions, both from the most immediate, concrete, specific, to the most cosmic, with the legal. Okay.
Not ethical.
Okay.
I was trying to follow up.
Thank you.
Steve, you mentioned Levinas and the notion of God and the ethical, Levinas and the notion of ethics, and I think there's something in my reading of both in Levinas and there's something considered to be kept in mind, and that is the relation of the author and the text. I mean, how ethics centers with the text. For Levinas, for example, my understanding of Levinas, ethics do not really emerge from an engagement with the text itself. He conducts hermeneutical reading of the Talmud, but that serves something which sits outside of the text, and that the author constitutes my own experience and my own ethical duties, and he returns back to his own tradition, the Talmudic tradition, trying to trace within its tradition what he defines as an ethical philosophy constituted on the author.
So in a certain sense, the Talmud is a proof text for his larger philosophical notion. Right. That, in other words, it's confirmed that in the Levinas that his ethical sense is confirmed through the deeper structures of these texts.
Yeah, and second command actually stresses the otherness of the text itself, which leads us to an ethical duty towards what we define as the other person. So there's kind of, in both cases, you have this other, but the question is what conditions wrong.
So that's a little bit closer to what I was hoping to get at, that namely the practice of reading is a spiritual process through the text of rethinking what it means to be a person in relationship to all that's other. And that each of those 4 dimensions expand the nature of consciousness from the concrete to the legal, cultural, to the theological, and I'll talk more about the kind of value, ethics, or spiritual practice in a couple of times, and then towards this kind of vast spiritual dimension. So it was that the text can open up different levels of transcendence and awareness. So I'm curious if other people had the same issue. Yeah, and then Dov, yeah.
I guess it very much connects with the ethical question, but I guess my question is one about the, for lack of a better word, the theory of the self that is operating here. And I think, again, to me at least, the issue of suffering becomes a key issue in the following way. I think that, for instance, if we insert here the category of depression, like deep, like devastating depression, for instance, there is something that becomes a prior moment to the ethical moment, which is the assumption that we have agency, right? And of course, we always have some degree of agency, but I think that kind of taking the devastating nature of depression sometimes can be a good way to add, I guess, at least one other layer to this reflection about the self that can be ethical in his or her reading of the text, but also in his or her reading of reality, right? And then interaction.
Why would one begin with depression as opposed to, let us say, a kind of radical finitude or humility, which is what's opened up from that
Yeah,
rupture.
I don't think that we need to begin there. I think that that's something that has to be considered, in my view at least, when we have a more holistic approach to the self that becomes a reader of the text and a self that poses himself or herself facing reality. Because I think that when we take that into account, we kind of have a different take about how we approach tradition, how we approach the challenges from Kant, Schleiermacher, or whoever, and how we approach just the possibility of really experiencing awe or experiencing that there is something that we can relate to still despite the fact that we're suffering. When we're really, I think, crushed, some of that agency to even think and use these different four ways of reading is so diminished that there is something about the self there that has to be at least incorporated in a way that, to say, well, hey, this is also something that we need to take into account when we think about the theological self, when we think about the theological reader.
I'd like you to write a paper, at least, that clarifies, because it's I'm not quite sure. Okay, what I was trying to suggest, very briefly, see how people were responding, is that the self, in a certain sense, is radically opened by these moments of primary rupture. That is to say, the self realizes its radical contingency within a sphere of radical vastness, to use that language. And then the question can be, how can one hold that in mind within the framework of all the tasks of culture? In other words, how do you hold a theological orientation in mind within the framework of the tasks of culture? So in a certain sense, the tasks of culture involve both the ethical or the day-to-day quotidian of that pshat level. They involve the legal and the theological reflections. In other words, the self is engaging in the world in multiple modalities, and through the reading of Scripture, the self is constantly being reformed in its awareness, both to the specifics of the task and its place within this larger theological vastness. So in other words, that from the point of view that I was trying to stress, and I just want to see what other people felt the same way, the theological task is opened up for the self at the beginning. And the question is how that can be kept in mind under all circumstances. That becomes part of that theological project, to receive all different things in the world within that, without losing consciousness of this more primordial awareness that is the fuller sense of theology behind or within the particular cultural challenges. And so the tasks of reading and doing, which appear in sacred attunement, is part of that exercise of consciousness to do that under different social and cognitive modes, which are not theological on their own terms, but only theological in relationship to this larger commanding presence, which is that presence of this huge vastness, which is the first primary imperative and claim upon the self. And that comes through all these other, what later become the commandments of very specific forms. That one has to attend to the claims that are being made, not only in this ultimate sense, but the claims of the specifics. And then those become reformulated as cultural commands or laws or the traditions, etc. Was that clear to people? Or
I'm curious what you would say about someone who doesn't feel that they've had such a moment. Whether these chaseral moments can be built up to, or the way prepared for them by jumping into the stream of reading and practice, or if one can only really start to think theologically after you feel that you have had some sort of primary moment of rupture.
Well, I don't think I can answer that in a general term. I think that the larger problem is what tradition calls the rationale for the commandments, what are called the ta'amei hamitzvot. Why one does this, right? So you would have to come up with a different reason for performing the commandments from a different type of cultural consciousness if one wasn't aware. The perspective that I was trying to bring in is that the ultimate rationale is this awareness of this massive experience that then conditions or puts into context every other form of attunement that one is related to over against this much larger configuration. So I don't think it's a matter of building up to that. It's a question of what is the starting point of a theological position that would give validity or rationale to these norms, beyond simply social convention or social imperatives and so on and so forth. So it becomes a commanding voice. I'll talk more about that issue of revelation, but I think I'm not trying to dodge the question. I just think that each person then would have to come up with their own understanding of what that rationale would be, which would be the primary commandment that puts everything into perspective. Does that make sense to others or people who are not from the Jewish tradition, or is there an aspect of that that you would qualify from a different perspective? Dov, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was going to come in on a slightly different issue. At the beginning of the class, we spoke about one of the biblical questions of can we retrieve Scripture as a spiritual instruction? And bearing that in mind, reading through Sacred Atonement, one of the questions that struck me was firstly the ethics came through very strongly. The question that came to me, and I'm trying to think about how to put this question most extreme and most sensibly, which is at some point, does the interpreted propositional meaning of the text become, in an ethical sense, secondary to the use as a tool for spiritual attunement? And the most radical formulation of this question is, does the Bible now become an arbitrary tool for spiritual attunement? Very well positioned for it, but in theory one could use any text that is well crafted. That would be the question, I guess.
Now, how would you answer it?
How would
I will answer you, but how? You're already indicating the puzzlement, right?
Right. It's an interesting puzzle, and I think I have the same puzzle with. I think Maimonides in some ways takes us to the same place.
Well,
He thinks that meditation is the primary goal of all of the commandments, and essentially they're basically, in some ways, arbitrary to lead us to that point.
well, maybe there was let me answer the way because the way you pose that splits between reading the text as a spiritual exercise for certain types of consciousness and what the text may actually be saying. Okay. So I was trying to answer that precisely through these 4 hermeneutical levels. That is to say, there is a synonymy between reading the text at these different levels and the way one is in the world. So, for example, at the pshat level, it's not just that I read past that at the plain sense for the sake of the world. But let us say, if I were to take a text like Abraham and the messengers who come and the task of hospitality. Or let's just take as a text like that. Okay? So the slow, patient reading of that text at its most fundamental semantic level, like what is implied, how do the sequences go together, where are the gaps, where appear to be the choice of an individual to act, what do you defer, and what are the priorities when a person comes before you and you're doing something else? Do different laws make different claims and priorities? Right? Does health take a priority over hospitality? Or the way the rabbis would say that Abraham was actually in prayer, and do you have to suspend law for the sake of supererogatory ethics and so on and so forth? What I'm saying is that that plain sense is not a given, what it actually means. You have to, it's not a proposition, you have to work through what is being said, how much is being said, who speaks, where are the gaps in the text, and as one works through that, one becomes more conscious of the ethical responsibilities of how one acts in the world when these things happen. In other words, that text itself becomes a normative instruction, but not as an abstract formal law. It becomes a conditioning to the structures of how one deals with circumstances. Okay? So, in that sense, it's a training for a certain type of consciousness. Okay? So it's both, you need the text in every single verbalization of the text at the pshat level, but it's also training you to a new sensibility to what it means to be concretely in the world in terms of how language works, how do you make choices, where are the priorities, what do you say, and of course you could critique that. So is that gap the right gap? Do I have a pushback against that text? The text is simply a springboard for a first level of pedagogy in the world. Okay? If I am then moving to the level of drash, let us say legal interpretation. Let's leave aside the theological. Okay? So, if I engage that through, let us say, the practice of how the rabbis constructed the hermeneutics of law, right? What the hermeneutics of legal reasoning is, right? So in other words, that would be part of that exercise that I read. Now I read it at a second level. But I'm not just studying that to see how the tradition solved the problem. I'm not just trying to see how this hermeneutical form of logic and this mechanism worked here, and how Rabbi X and Rabbi Y use different conceptual mechanisms to solve the problem. I'm also becoming hyper aware of how one makes legal decisions and the role of language in making those decisions. What is being brought into play when the rabbis make a legal decision and justify it in this kind of a way? What is at stake when I'm trying to justify a practice? In other words, there's a meta-notion that goes along with simply learning from the tradition of a certain form of legal reasoning. But then the spiritual practice is to take that to another level. What does it mean to think about personhood or property under these conditions, so that you become aware of the meta-legal issues of the norms, of what's really at stake? In other words, you're asking another issue because you're aware that your life at the level of norm and law is always making decisions about persons and property and all kinds of issues, and that becomes a mode of reflection, and also to see what the ultimate basis of the legal construction is, so that you become aware of the responsibility of making law within that framework. In other words, which you wouldn't normally have done. You'd be trying to resolve problems as opposed to thinking about, if you choose this legal mechanism as opposed to that mechanism, what is the notion of the person or the society? Is this a strict or an open construction that I'm doing? And what does it mean to live spiritually or ethically with that? In other words, and you're seeing within a much broader canvas. So in other words, I'm not giving up the legal teaching, but the rabbis would not say there's no plain sense meaning of the law. I have to read it with the tradition. So now I have to meditate, what are the ethical or spiritual implications of taking this legal construction over that legal construction? And how do I see my life within the larger tradition as having made choices? And can I live with all those choices? And do I see, is there, within those gaps, what is making a claim upon me? Right? In other words, so I'm living at multiple levels simultaneously. I'm living that practice, but I'm also having a meta-communication about that practice, because I become aware of what the legal implications are of using certain forms of justification and action. Or, as I was indicating, let us say, with the Abraham material, when do you suspend one law for the sake that another law is more compelling under that circumstance? Right? Or is property or person more significant? And those become issues that emerge every moment in the legal discussions, but they're not discussed that way. So that becomes another way of thinking of oneself, as that one's ethical life has legal implications, right? And so that it becomes another form of training through Scripture to think about what it means to be in the world, not just at the level of interpersonal relations, but when these become norms and they become formalized, and all the contingency of culture involved in that. Now that's obviously a more modern perspective than a traditional one would say, well, we have to work around that, but the awareness of that openness is part of the more modern perspective of that. So then the third, I just use one other example. I'm going to go more into these in detail in succeeding weeks, but just to stay on what I was trying to do at that first level of Pardes, or those four levels. So you take the issue of remez, right? The issue of philosophical allegory. Well, there is no philosophical allegory at the surface level. So then you say, if I'm going to use that hermeneutical mode of philosophical allegory as a spiritual training exercise. Now I'm going to read it at this level, right? Because I'm doing it at different levels. Because I live at multiple levels. I not only live at an interpersonal level, I live at a legal, social level. And then if I'm doing it at the philosophical level, well, I may not be able, in the first instance, to have any personal relationship with Aristotle's notion of philosophical reason, or his particular notion, let us say, of virtue ethics. I'll come back to that issue of virtue. I may not. But I may have already developed, let us say, Foucault's whole notion of the hermeneutics of care of the self, right? I may also, from a modern point of view, feel a need not just to be a person who lives within cultural norms, but to develop an interpersonal spiritual, moral, spiritual development. In what way can my reading of the text help me cultivate a certain form of spiritual development? That is, that I read it from not from the point of view of a different form of allegory. That it's helping me, let us say, overcome my nature, or it's helping me overcome X or Y. So my answer to you at these three levels is this: I think the presupposition that you, and I'm not this is not a challenge what you do, but the presupposition of the argument that you're making is that the text is already saying something, and then if I do another kind of reading, I'm throwing away that reading, right? And what I'm trying to suggest is that the text is read at multiple levels, and one has to take responsibility for what level one is reading, and how that text not only can instruct through the tradition, but how that reading in with the tradition can also have a meta level of reflection of what it means for me to live theologically in the world, attuned to multiple things, and also that once I become aware of the constructed nature of these interpretations, my hermeneutical task unfolds into that larger sense of vastness and increases that level of responsibility of what I'm doing. So my claim is that if you have that larger theological vision, it puts all these other levels within a much larger theological context, because you begin from the inside out with a theological position, right? That is, you have to. That's part of the claim, that you have to start with an interior position and move outward. I think traditionally you start with the outward side and you try to find reasons inside, but that's when the modern problem has turned us back towards this issue that I mentioned as authenticity and integrity. So you have to start from the inside going out, and that's why I was starting from that rationale, or the tam hamitzvot. It has to start with what is that first ultimate claim within which everything now is reoriented, and it still retains a certain type of authority. Okay, so I think if there's any factor that emerges from what you're saying, is that sometimes from a traditional point of view you say, well, the text already means this, and if I read it another level, I'm throwing all of that away. And what I'm suggesting is that there is the hermeneutic reflexivity is to say, I'm going to read very closely at this level of all these. The tradition has given me 4 levels of working through text, which allow me to expand my consciousness of what it means to be in the world in different ways. Not just to tell me what tradition said about the pshat, or what tradition has told me about legal midrash, but in the process of that study, to engage in a meta-reflection of the spiritual task of that. It's not just an abstract hermeneutical thing, because it's in that context of theology. Theology comes first and last. So it's always already there. Otherwise, how would you move from the task to theology? I mean, the easy way is, you're born there, so you just sort of are in the soup. But that's the reason why I started today's class differently, where most of us are not simply in the soup, right? In other words, there's a consciousness that makes this a little bit more problematic. And then this becomes a different mode. Does that sort of help about the relationship between the ethics or the spirituality of reading under different modes? In other words, these 4 different modes establish hermeneutical ways of being in the world. Right? And they teach you that you live at the world simultaneously at multiple levels. And you learn through the tradition or the text that you're cultivating not only knowledge of the tradition, but then that's just encyclopedic knowledge. Right? How does that become a theological standpoint? Because we're not talking simply about, globbing on the tradition or accepting it. The theological task is a different one, and it's a different form of appropriation. Is that helpful?
It is very helpful. I mean, to try and kind of make my question as refined as possible, even if one doesn't come with the traditional perspective that the text already means something, but it's almost a blank semiotic pattern that we're now going to render at 4 different levels. I guess the question still is the reading process where the ethics is found, or is it in the text itself? However one renders that.
How would you separate the two?
Well, in theory, you could separate the two.
In other words, you discover the ethical process within that notion, but you bring, if I'm reading it even at the plain sense level, I'm already bringing my whole modern sensibility to that. Right?
Of course. I mean, in some sense, maybe a concrete example would be helpful for me. If you take the passage of the Binding of Isaac, you could put that through the 4 hermeneutical levels and come out with the shut sense of universal humanity, and come through the different levels to the contingency of decisions and how important implications are. But then the question would be...
Well, I could read that text. Let's say, so why don't we take that as an exercise? Because I used the text of Jacob. But let's take Genesis 22 as a thought exercise from that point of view. Okay, so let's try it. So I start reading, and I am immediately forced to reflect on task and test. What does it mean to engage in a challenge that seems to upset my whole prior expectations of life? What does it mean to respond with immediacy and alacrity? How do you deal with another person in terms of secrets? Right? In other words, I'm reading the text. But what in fact constitutes the pshat of that text? Abraham knows one thing, Isaac knows something else, and what is the relationship between father and son when there are different tasks and there are secrets? What is the nature of obligation and loyalty? In other words, that's not necessarily, that could be asked as a question from the midrashic theological point of view, but I'm saying that immediately arises at the plain sense of the text, right? From the Kierkegaard, does religious commitment trump ethics? Does ethics, what is the relationship between value and the ethics? And where do they... In other words, I'm forced, as I'm moving across every single movement of that text, to be thinking about it. Now, you could say, well, that's exactly what the rabbis did in terms of theological drash, but they are reading that text at the closest level because the text... Well, the commitment is to say, I'm going to be instructed by that text, but I'm not just reading it for the storyline. right? There's no simple synopsis at that level, right? If I'm next reading it, let us say at a theological level, right? I would still have to raise the question of what is the spiritual authority of a father over a son over questions of idolatry, and these are questions that are emerged in the Middle Ages, right? What are the limits of martyrdom, right? So we see in this text here, you have to be ready to give up your life. Well, the rabbis have a huge discussion that one can put one's life in jeopardy, right? And they saw this as a huge ethical problem. Can you put it, or for martyrdom? Under what circumstance are you obligated to save your life rather than give theological testimony? Right? So that's already at legal levels, right? If I'm reading the text at the level of allegory, right? So I make a decision. If I'm going to try to read it at this level, how do I begin to say, how do I suppress natural need for ethical or spiritual need? Do I have the capacity to do that? Right? So I'm reading the text, but the text traditionally says, well, you have another third level. So I'm trying to instruct myself with a series of other questions of spiritual growth, ethical growth, dealing with competing loyalties, competing tensions, natural desire for child or loyalty towards higher value. And I'm dealing with that not as making a larger cultural claim for the truth of what the culture may have decided, but how do I deal with that in terms of my own reflection? So the text remains the text, but what it becomes is transformed at the hermeneutic level. At the level of simply the contingency of action, legal obligation, when legal obligation includes religious obligation, the secrecy and loyalty, deception, Kierkegaard's the teleological suspension of the ethical. Those are legal questions, right? Are there, is it? I have a theological commitment, so is collateral damage just something I have to put up with, right? Or what are the limits of obligation? It raises that question. What are the limits of obligation under certain human and spiritual circumstances? Right? Rabbis raise that, so the whole issue of collaboration with tyranny. I'll save your city if you give up one person. Right? The rabbis raise that. So what about, that's a whole legal problem in the collaboration with tyranny at the legal level for the rabbis. And you could correlate that back with this issue, right? In terms of the obligation to save a person under certain circumstances, the sanctity of a life over against a larger claim, and then the inner emotions of the self. So, like, what was the text? So the text becomes a training point for levels of consciousness, right? Right? If I was to see this at the larger level of the mystical level of Sod, right? So I might have to deal with the notion, and this comes back to the issue we're talking about, at what level is suffering a dimension of existence itself? Right? In other words, the tradition has opened up various kinds of issues, or what's the notion of substitution? The very notion of substitution. Self-sacrifice or other sacrifice. both at a legal level and at a cosmic level, right? So what I'm saying is, in this case, we're not giving up there's no propositional notion of the text. We make a hermeneutical decision to read the cultural words at different levels. And you may be guided by the tradition, or tradition may have had answers, but from the point of view of sacred attunement, I make a different decision. I come back to the matrix of Scripture, but now my task is to use traditional mechanisms of interpretation to cultivate my spiritual and ethical and personal consciousness in different ways. And that becomes a way that I can reappropriate this under the conditions of modernity, or a way. In other words, the text remains an imperative to me. I can't be a Jewish person who doesn't, among other things, also work through the issues through this text. But, and this relates to these other issues, it may be that my notion of what sacrifice is, my notion of what the priority of life is, my notion of the relationship between value and property, or the rights of a father over a child, may actually have been ethically and spiritually developed by my notion of what another religion or another text has done. And part of my claim is that if I bring that back in to a thoroughly grounded Jewish reading, it becomes part of what I've learned from the totality of the world back into the tradition. The tradition is filled out hugely. I don't have to say, well, that's a notion, or Adrian was talking about Maya and illusion. So let's say, I say, you want to come to the issue of the correct perception of reality. So I've learned something about that, but I'm not talking about it from a Hindu point of view. I've learned certain kind of categories from my reading, and then if I can reinsert this back into an authentic reading, then it becomes a Jewish or a Christian, it reinforces my theological life. You'll know pretty fast if it can't work. You'll know very fast, or you'll simply be an outlier to the tradition, and you'll know that too. But if it does deepen it, then you've been able to take that scriptural text as a matrix, and although you're using 4 hermeneutical categories to cultivate consciousness, you're also able to bring in many things that you may have learned from the Western philosophical or legal or psychological tradition, but you have to kind of reformulate that in native terms. And you'll know when you can't do that, or you'll know when people say, that's really pushing it, right? So, you may know that much quicker if you have to give a sermon in your synagogue. I may know that less quickly if I can just talking to myself in my room. But nevertheless, there's a whole spectrum of what it means to be authentic and communication. So you don't have to. So what I'm trying to suggest is that is the ritual dimension of reading at the Pardes level. The text becomes different modalities which affect thought and consciousness and commitment to the world, and they become theological because they are set within this much larger notion of being aware of the implication of hermeneutical action within the framework of that primary theological condition, which was this issue of the epoche of this spirit of that. Is that a little bit better, that thought experiment? Does that work a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you can say that to any of your congregants. But we don't care about that, right? I think there are different kind of communities that you talk to, and so you'd have to talk at different levels. You might have to say that in very different terms. Within the framework of this setting, we can talk a different language.
Right. And I guess it's just helpful. I guess maybe I was misreading. I didn't get the emphasis on the thematic claim as well as the claim of the themes that one thinks through, not just the practice.
Okay, so that's why I had chosen one text, but you could do this with multiple texts. All right, so it's helpful. So maybe let's say it's Tzvi, and if anybody else want to add something, then we'll
Yeah.
and then we'll break.
Just to follow up on Doug's question. So basically, understanding the scripture from the level of practice is basically understanding the scripture not as a propositional statement or Aristotelian sense, but rather something kind of sense outside of it. The question is whether, in light of this discussion, to what extent and in what way can we speak of philology with regard to scripture in light of this notion of understanding scripture from the Midrashic and the way the scripture is unfolded through the Midrash through interpretation? Is there any philology in the sense of, can we speak of philology outside or in isolation from the unfolding of the scripture through the Midrashic interpretations?
I would reframe that. I would say, what is the dimension of language that's working at these different levels? There are different ways of understanding the philological task, because there would be different ways of noting of what you could do with a word. We see in a case like this, you can divide the word up in multiple ways, and it has different semantic significance when you read it in a totally different, in what ancient Near Eastern philology would say was absolutely illegitimate. But that because it has a different notion of what word is and what a philological term is. So you have to always make a decision, how is the language working at the legal level of rabbinic midrash? What words can mean and how they correlate with each other to kind of narrow a focus or expand the focus by bringing one word in relationship to another.
Yeah, but
Is its own hermeneutical structure, because the notion of how language would work in a legal text would be different. Where you could make a restriction and where you make an expansion. What would permit an analogy and what would not permit an analogy. And you would not necessarily see that at the plain sense level, but at the, let us say, at the legal hermeneutical level, there's a whole philology of how you would see correlations between themes or words that would allow you to make a different kind of an argument, right?
I was kind of more specifically referring to this philology in the kind of the academic, rigorous, classical sense, and trying to kind of the attempt to isolate the text itself from its reception.
So then that would be the task at the pshat level, where everything would be. It would be a hyper-discrimination of phonemes and lexemes and semantics and syntax and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the second straight week when you asserted that you can't take this type of theological method to a congregation. And my sense is that I was just
utzing.
Okay. My sense is that I disagree with that, but what's behind that? What part of this kind of method of hermeneutics, this method of doing theology, do you think wouldn't work in a congregational setting?
You would have to lay it out different. You have to know who you're talking to, right? You can say the same thing in multiple ways. So I think there are different settings in which different languages would work, and where the same thing in one context might be offensive or confusing, in another place it would be reinforcing. So you have to determine how do you teach in different circumstances. That's really all that I meant, and but it means that there's some things people can't say in the same public way than you would say privately, or things like that, or there may be lots of private thoughts that one would necessarily share in a public way. I think all these are the different distinctions that different people make, but I think this is a pedagogy. The pedagogy of theological instruction works at different. You assume that you're teaching to different levels of consciousness, right? You didn't talk. So that's really all that I meant. In certain circumstances, it's the reinforcement of commitment rather than seeing its laying it out in terms of its open-ended hermeneutical possibilities. So you have to say, what is my responsibility as a teacher? The academy allows a very different form of hermeneutical openness. Steve, and then we'll break. Yeah.
What bothers me about this approach is that it seems to me to require a fairly sophisticated approach in terms of what my questions are before I approach the text. In other words, instead of getting from the text the questions, I have to have a pretty clear idea that the things I'm concerned about, our Father, Son, I have to have a pretty good view that I have to know what the relationship is. The thing that I got out of Sacred Attunement was I think it's really important in our everyday life to be aware of the world around us that I don't understand and that my obligation to other people. But to approach the text on the basis of certain existing questions that are in my mind beforehand require me an initial step, at least is what I'm hearing from that I have a clear view of what the questions are I want to explore after being aware of that terror and law.
So just so that you know, and we'll end with this. So just so that you know that I'm not. This is already an issue from antiquity, right? So there's the very classic text that appears in the end of Deuteronomy, where it says that the Torah is not in heaven, and then it goes on to say, "Velo davar reik hu mikem." So it's not something that's empty for you, right? It's not something. And the Midrash explains that if it is reik, if it's empty, it's mikem, because you are empty. Ve'enchem yodim lidrosh. You don't know how to interpret. So in other words, if the text doesn't have capacity, you don't have questions to ask the text. So in other words, all I'm simply saying is that I understand what you're saying as a hermeneutical challenge, that you have to start with that the hermeneutical circle is such that you have to enter it at some level, right? What the rabbis are saying by that interpretation is that you have to have a will to interpret that text. As that's the precondition, the will to interpret.
I agree with that.
And that you're willing, and the presupposition that the text can sustain a hermeneutical engagement. So they're saying that in the 2nd and 3rd century, their questions are different from yours. They say you don't know how to exposit, which means you don't know the traditional way that you could get a lot of meaning out of what looks like an empty text or plain sense text. Now,
Could you say that?
What?
Could you say that the text itself stimulates the questions? That's what I would want
sure.
to say.
I haven't got
to me that rather than reading the text.
But how do you formulate the question? I mean, it stimulates, and then what is the hermeneutical lens in which you formulate? That's your modern issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anybody else? All right. So what we're going to pick up with next week is to pick up on a return back to these 4 levels, but from a very different hermeneutical perspective. So part of the reading that you should have online would be the readings of Levinas, Lingus, and a couple of other things. And then I will be talking about that. But I want to kind of reappropriate all of this now at a very different level of theology. Okay? Okay, thank you.
No, I don't want to talk about that.